When I was a kid, the Super Nintendo was one of the best consoles around, but unfortunately all the games cost a heck of a lot of money. And I used to think, wouldn't it be great if there was a cartridge that had every single game ever made, but on one cart? Well, back then it was science fiction, but today it's reality. This here is the SD2SNES, otherwise known as the SNES Everdrive, and it's supposed to play every single game ever made on the Super Nintendo. Let's take a look at this thing. I'm also gonna need the Super Nintendo because, you know, it's kind of for the review. So. This specific cart was sent to us in by Stone Age Gamer, which is a pretty cool company that takes a lot of these carts and kind of makes it easier for consumers to get a hold of. So you can buy the actual internals of this cartridge and build the whole thing yourself, but I'm not really that handy with a lot of tools, so it's nice when the company goes and does it themselves. And I gotta say, the fit and polish on this thing is really cool. It comes in a really big clamshell case that I actually kind of enjoy a lot, and it's got a really nice gold sticker on the back, and well, a lot of time and effort's been put onto this, making it look like a real Super Nintendo cartridge. Heck, even the one I got came with an SD card that has a special SD2SNES little sticker on it, so that's good as well. It's 16 gigabytes, and that's enough to carry every single Super Nintendo game, well, ever made on it. The SD2SNES is a cartridge that basically says can play every single Super Nintendo game out there, or at least a bunch of them. See, it really can't do every single game because, well, the Super Nintendo is kind of an interesting console. Now, many of you out there may already know this, but for those of you that don't, most games on the Super Nintendo are, well, regular. They just have a cartridge, they just go into the Super Nintendo, and they use the Super Nintendo hardware. But there's a couple games out there that have unique features. For instance, little processor chips and additional hardware and components that was included on the cartridge. And the Super Nintendo can actually bypass some of its power into the cartridge itself and utilize these extra mechanics and pieces. And these pieces can do pretty interesting things, like the Super FX chip, which can basically do 3D polygonal graphics on the Super Nintendo. And this is why you get games like Star Fox looking so cool when other Super Nintendo games didn't look like that unless they had the same kind of hardware. Now, unfortunately, cartridges like the one we're using here really can't access those, well, pieces because they're not included on this cart itself. And that kind of makes it impossible to play. Only they kind of have a solution that isn't quite working yet, but they do promise it is going to work eventually. There's this processor that's on this cartridge called the MSU1, and the MSU1 is said to be able to replicate a lot of those technologies that they used to use on the Super Nintendo. And they are going out and trying to make as many things work as they can, but that requires firmware updates and things over time, and well, unfortunately, the cartridge doesn't do everything yet. It'll play pretty much like 85% of the games on the Super Nintendo, but things like Star Fox and any of those games that utilize those kind of effects chips, well, they're not going to work, and that's kind of unfortunate, especially if you're buying this cartridge hoping to play things like Star Fox 2, which you really wouldn't be able to play on a normal Super Nintendo unless you had a bootleg cartridge. So that's kind of a bad thing. But the promissory note of one of these cartridges eventually working in the future is nice, because they've said that this cartridge isn't going to get any hardware revisions, it's just going to get firmware updates. So that's kind of good. In the future it may happen, but keep in mind that it might not. Now, this cartridge can play a lot of Super Nintendo games, and a lot of them really, really well. Every single Super Nintendo game that I tried that did turn on worked perfectly fine without any glitches or without any errors, which was pretty damn solid. But there's also some additional features that this Super Nintendo is actually really good at. See, it's capable of running homebrew games with some really cool perks. Now, this MSU1 processor I was talking about before, well, people have been making use of that to do some pretty damn cool things. Now, a lot of you out there may know Rock and Roll Racing, which is a really fun game utilizing a lot of, well, modern music at the time. Probably not so modern, to be honest, but really cool digitized versions of the songs. And they do sound old in the way that they are. But what they decided to do with this new chip was basically take the original music that that game was emulating and replicate it one-to-one just like you were listening to it on a CD. This cartridge has the ability to do CD quality audio simply because there's so much space on the SD card. And that's really cool. We were taking a look at some pretty interesting games that had whole new soundtracks just because they have so much space on this card. And it runs right through a regular Super Nintendo just utilizing this new processor on this cartridge. It's pretty awesome. We played The Legend of Zelda with an orchestral score and even some animated cutscenes. Seriously guys, animated cutscenes on the Super Nintendo. I'm talking like MP4 animated video type stuff. But unfortunately, this is one of the problems you'll have with this cartridge. You see, that stuff is still in its early days and it doesn't quite work perfectly. Now, unfortunately, every time we tried out one of the video files that they have on these games, they always seem to crash, and that really sucked. Now, the technology is going to work a little bit better as time goes on, we hope, but as of this moment, it's just not perfect. The music seemed to work really well, especially in F-Zero, and I'm telling you, if you like F-Zero's soundtrack originally, listening to this new one with the CD quality audio, it's another world. You just imagine that that's what the game used to sound like back when you played it in the 90s. But now it, well, kinda does sound like it used to sound in your head, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately though, even the soundtrack sometimes can have some tiny little glitches here and there, but that just exists in like a 2-second little buffer sound that doesn't really affect gameplay. When the videos crash, they crash for good, and in most cases they'll actually crash the games. For instance, they actually took Road Avenger, a game that was never released on the Super Nintendo, and ported it to this cartridge with this new processor tech. And, well, it works up until a point for me until it crashes. But when the processor's working and you're able to actually play a full motion video game completely with this cart, you're going to be able to do things on the Super Nintendo that were never available before. I know there's a whole bunch of people out there that saw this cartridge and went, "Oh boy, I'm going to be able to plug this up to my Retron 5 and play every Super Nintendo game ever made." But it doesn't work like that. This thing does not work on the Retron 5, and the reason is that while the Retron 5 is really good at sucking all the information from a cartridge and putting it into the RAM, it's not good at using the built-in hardware of the actual cartridge itself. And this cartridge has an additional piece of hardware that's an SD card that the RAM on the Retron 5 simply can't read. So unfortunately, where you can, I guess, run the internals of this cartridge, you wouldn't be able to play any of the ROMs, so you just kind of have a blank menu to look at, I guess, if it even runs. Unfortunately, as far as I could tell, it couldn't work. But on clone systems like the Retro Duo and the Retro Trio, yeah, this works perfectly fine. It works just like it's on a real Super Nintendo. So if you have one of those, you can get this, and you'll be good to go. But I would still recommend a real Super Nintendo over a clone system just because, well, you're trying to get the most authentic kind of experience, and sometimes clone systems might have issues like clock speeds that are a little bit different that could really harm your ability and impact on the way you play certain games. But speaking from experience, using this on a real Super Nintendo, the gameplay, everything about the games, and the speed, it all runs exactly like the original games. And unlike certain emulations that run a little bit faster, a little bit slower, you don't have to worry about anything when playing games on this cartridge. The SD2SNES is a pretty solid cartridge, and although the price can be pretty expensive, I do recommend it. Now, because you're able to run an original Super Nintendo running all these games as if they were originally intended to run on the system, well, you're gonna have a lot of fun with this. There is a huge library of SNES games out there that will run with this cartridge, and, well, it kind of is a lot cheaper than going out and getting all the cartridges yourself. I'm not one to promote piracy, and honestly, if you own the original cartridges, that's when I would recommend getting the ROMs for this thing. But traditionally, there are games that simply have never been reissued, never been re-released, and in some cases just weren't released in certain regions to be able to run, and that kinda sucks. With this cartridge, it unlocks an entire world of Super Nintendo games, and in some cases, ROMs and hacks and additional features that people have put into these games over the time online that you can only run with cartridges like this, or by just taking older cartridges and kind of flashing the memory on them. And that stuff can be a little bit tech-heavy. With this, you're just dumping ROMs onto an SD card, throwing it on the cartridge, and putting it on your real Super Nintendo. It doesn't get much easier than this. There are tons of ways to get cartridges like this, but this one is my personal favorite. So, if you can get this one, I highly recommend it. It's definitely worth the money.